Dishonest cop accuses black carpenter of vandalizing a church. Then the blueprint has his signature. Samuel Isaiah Okafor had been working on churches his whole adult life. Not preaching in them, not singing in them, building them, restoring them, learning their bones. He was 58 years old in the spring he took the Greater Hope Baptist Church contract. In those 58 years, he had spent more hours inside old buildings than anywhere else he could name. He knew what original lath looked like when it had dried out over a century. He knew the smell of old horsehair plaster, sharp and chalky the way it released when you broke a section away. He knew the difference between a wall that could be opened and one that needed reinforcement first. He had learned these things the hard way on job sites across 4 counties, and he had formalized that learning through a contractor's license that had been current and clean for 22 years. Okafor Construction and Restoration. The name was on his truck, on his hard hat, on his business cards, and on the building permit posted in the front window of Greater Hope Baptist Church. That permit had been there since January. This was March. Samuel was not a man who talked much on job sites. He was methodical. He arrived early, assessed, planned, worked. His assistant, a 24-year-old named Marcus Webb, had been with him for 2 years and had learned to follow Samuel's rhythm without being told. When Samuel moved slowly around a section of wall, pressing his palm against it, tilting his ear toward the plaster, Marcus waited. He knew something important was happening. On a Sunday afternoon in March, that methodical rhythm was what was happening inside Greater Hope Baptist Church. That was when a neighbor 3 houses down the block picked up her phone and called the Millbrook Police Department. She was an elderly woman, 73 years old, who had lived in her house on Ellison Avenue for 31 years. She was not a malicious person. She had heard the sounds through her wall in the afternoon, the banging, the cracking, the irregular rhythm of demolition. She had not known what to make of them. She had not seen the yellow permit card in the church window. She had not walked over to look. She called the non-emergency line and described what she heard. She said she thought someone might be breaking something inside the church. She did not know it was a workday on the building. She lived in her house with her television and her routines, and she had done what she thought was the right thing. This was strictly speaking the triggering event. A worried neighbor, a phone call, a response. The call went to dispatch. Dispatch sent a unit, and the unit was Officer Brent Corby's. None of this was the problem. The problem began when Corby walked up to the front door of Greater Hope Baptist Church. The church stood on the corner of Ellison Avenue and 14th Street on the east side of Millbrook. It had been built in 1919. Its founders had laid its cornerstone in a neighborhood that was then and remained predominantly black. Over 104 years, it had weathered renovations, additions, and a fire in 1967 that had consumed the original rear vestibule. What remained was largely original: the main sanctuary, the side galleries, the interior columns, the plaster and lath walls that rose 20 feet to the ceiling on either side of the nave. Those walls were failing. It was not dramatic. It was not urgent in the way that a fire or a flood is urgent. It was the slow failure of a very old building. The horsehair plaster had separated from the lath in several sections, creating hollow spaces inside the wall. These spaces were invisible from the surface, but Samuel had identified them by tapping the plaster with his knuckle, listening for the dead sound that meant detachment. The structural lath behind those sections had dried and split and was no longer doing its job. Left alone, the sections would eventually fall. A piece of plaster ceiling cornice weighing 8 pounds, dropping 20 feet into a pew, could hurt or kill someone. The restoration plan addressed these sections one by one. The plan had been developed over 6 weeks before Samuel ever set foot inside the building with tools. He had pulled the church's archival files, the original construction drawings, the 1930s addition plans, the records of the 1967 repairs. In those files, folded into a cardboard sleeve that had not been opened in decades, he had found something remarkable. The original architectural blueprint of the church's interior, hand-drafted in 1919 ink on vellum with the architect's name in the title block A.R. Merriman. The drawing showed the full interior elevation of the north and south nave walls. The column positions the gallery framing the window placements. All of it was rendered in a precise hand that spoke of a draftsman who had taken his time. It showed the original interior as it was intended to be built. It was the kind of document that contractors almost never found intact. Samuel had photographed it. He had taken it to an architectural reprographics shop in the city and had paid for a professional reproduction on archival quality paper full scale. When the reproductions came back, he reviewed each sheet at his desk at home, comparing the original to the reproduction checking dimensions. And on each sheet in the lower right corner in the space reserved for contractor notation, he had signed his name, Samuel A. Okafor, and below it the date he had reviewed that sheet. The reproductions went into a tube. The tube went into his truck. They had been in his truck for 3 months. The restoration work plan divided the interior into 12 numbered zones. Samuel and the church board had reviewed the plan together at the table in the church's fellowship hall before Samuel ever applied for the permit. Specifically, he had reviewed it with Deacon Robert Tillman, who chaired the building committee. Deacon Tillman was 64, a retired postal supervisor who had been a member of Greater Hope for 40 years and who had served on the building committee for 15 of them. He was not a contractor. He did not know what lath was when Samuel first used the word in front of him. But he was a methodical man, and he asked questions until he understood. "What are we doing to each zone?" he had asked, looking at the plan drawings spread out on the table. Samuel had explained. In each zone, he said, we remove the failed plaster and the deteriorated lath. We inspect the framing behind it. We make any framing repairs. We install new lath and apply new plaster matched to the original in composition and texture. We work one zone at a time. We do not open new zones until the previous zone is closed. The building never has more than one active work area at a time. "What about dust and noise?" Deacon Tillman had asked. "We sheet off the work zone from the rest of the sanctuary," Samuel had said. "The congregation can use the building during construction. Sunday services will not be disrupted unless there is a structural finding that requires full building closure. I will give you advance notice of any such finding." What kind of structural finding would close the building, Deacon Tillman had asked. Samuel had told him. Deacon Tillman had nodded. He had signed the contract. The permit application had gone in the next week. The permit had been issued and posted in the front window of the church before Samuel brought his first tool inside. The permit was a standard Millbrook City Building permit card printed on yellow cardstock, 8.5 by 11 inches. It was laminated and mounted in a clear plastic sleeve attached to the inside of the front window with suction cups. It listed the permit number, the address, the type of work, interior, structural restoration, the permit holder, Officer Construction and Restoration, and the permit issuance date. It was visible from the sidewalk. Anyone who walked up the front steps and looked through the glass could read it. It had been in that window for 3 months. On the Sunday afternoon in March, Samuel and Marcus were working in Zone 4. Zone 4 was the lower section of the south nave wall between the second and third columns from the rear. It was approximately 12 feet wide and 8 feet high, bounded at the top by a decorative plaster molding that was intact and sound and was not to be touched. Samuel had already completed Zones 1, 2, and 3. He knew the wall. He knew what was behind it. He had probed it, mapped it, photographed it, and submitted the zone-by-zone progress photos to the city building department as required by the permit conditions. The work that day was demolition, the controlled removal of the failed plaster and deteriorated lath in Zone 4. This was the noisiest part of the process. Breaking plaster makes sound. A hammer striking lath makes sound. Debris falling into a wheelbarrow makes sound. There is no way to do this work quietly, and there is no reason to. It is authorized work on a workday in a building where a permit is posted in the window. Marcus was on the scaffold working from the top of the zone downward with a flat bar. Samuel was on the floor directing, watching the framing being revealed as the lath came away assessing it. dust moved through the air. The sheeting that bounded the zone held most of it in. The work lights they had set up lit the interior wall in a flat white light that showed every detail of the framing. Samuel saw what he had expected to see. The original framing members were in good condition. The lath was the problem, and the lath was now coming down, which was the plan. He noted the condition of 2 floor joists visible at the base of the wall. He made a note in his field notebook. He looked at his watch. They had about 2 more hours of daylight. He wanted to get the zone completely cleared before they stopped for the day. He liked working on Sundays when the church was not in service. The quiet of the building without a congregation was different from the quiet of an empty warehouse or an empty house. There was a quality of held attention in an old church when no one was in it. The pews caught the side light. The smell of old wood and old plaster and the faint ghost of decades of candle wax was present in a way you only fully noticed when no one else was there. He had worked in old buildings his whole career. He had never quite gotten over the feeling of them. The age of the material, the accumulation of all the days and hours that had passed inside those walls. He was thinking about the framing. He was thinking about the floor joist he had noted, which seemed sound, but which he wanted to probe at the base before making a final assessment. He was thinking about nothing except the building. That was the state he most often worked in, a state of focused, narrow attention on the thing in front of him. That was when he heard the front door of the church open. He turned. A man in a Millbrook police uniform was standing in the doorway, one hand on the doorframe looking into the interior. Samuel could not see the man's expression clearly from where he stood, but he could see the posture. The officer was not moving. He was looking at the debris on the floor, the scaffold, the opened wall, the dust in the air. He was looking at Marcus. He was looking at Samuel. Samuel set down his notebook. He walked toward the officer. Officer Brent Corby was 36 years old and had been with the Millbrook Police Department for 9 years. He had responded to calls at the corner of Ellison and 14th before. The east side of Millbrook was not unknown to him. He had a general familiarity with the neighborhood the way a patrol officer develops familiarity with his sector, the storefronts, the residents, the addresses that generated calls. Greater Hope Baptist Church was not an address that generated calls. In 9 years, he could not recall responding to anything at this address. But the call that had come in this afternoon described banging sounds, breaking sounds, the possibility of vandalism. He had pulled up. He had seen no vehicles on the street that he could immediately connect to the building. The front door was unlocked. He had pushed it open. What he saw was this: a partially demolished interior wall, plaster debris on the floor scaffold, tools dust, and 2 black men, one on the scaffold, one walking toward him. He did not look at the window to his left as he stood in the doorway. The permit was there in its plastic sleeve on the glass facing outward toward the street 2 feet from where he was standing. He did not look at it. There was nothing ambiguous about the permit's location. It was not obscured. It was not placed in a back window or an interior room. It was in the front window, the window immediately adjacent to the front door. It was where anyone about to push open that door would naturally look. It was large and yellow and printed clearly. It was the standard placement. It was where permits were always posted. Any officer with 9 years on the job had seen permits in windows. Corby had seen permits in windows. He knew what they were. He chose not to look. Samuel stopped a few feet from the officer. He said, "Good afternoon, officer. I'm Samuel Okafor. I'm the licensed contractor on this restoration project." Corby looked at him. He looked at the debris. He looked at the scaffold. He said, "What's going on in here?" "Scheduled restoration work," Samuel said. "We're doing a controlled demo of a failed plaster section. It's Zone 4 of the approved work plan. The building permit is posted in the front window," Corby said. "Who let you in this building?" Samuel looked at him for a moment. "I have a key," he said. "I've had a key since January. I've been the contractor on this building for 3 months." "Can I see some ID?" Corby said. "Of course," Samuel said. He reached into his back pocket for his wallet. He produced his driver's license and his contractor's license. He held both out. Corby took them. He looked at them. He looked at Samuel. He looked at Marcus, who had climbed down from the scaffold and was standing near it watching. Corby said, "Both of you need to step outside." Samuel said, "I can show you the building permit. It's right there in the window. It's got my company name on it. The work we're doing today is exactly what it says." Corby said, "Sir, I need you to step outside." Samuel stepped outside. Marcus followed. They stood on the front steps of the church in the March afternoon light while Corby spoke into his radio. Samuel stood with his hands at his sides. He was 58 years old. He owned a 22-year-old licensed contracting business. He had a signed restoration contract in his truck and a building permit in that window with his company name on it. He stood quietly on the steps. Corby came out and stood with them. He said he was going to need to call this in as a possible vandalism scene and wait for another officer. Samuel looked at him. He said, "Officer, the permit is in the window right there. Do you need me to read it to you?" Corby said, "Sir, please don't make this difficult." Samuel said nothing else. He pulled out his phone. He found the number for Deacon Robert Tillman. He pressed call. Deacon Tillman was at his sister's house 3 miles away when his phone rang. He saw the name on the screen, Samuel the contractor, and answered it. Samuel's voice was even. He told Deacon Tillman what was happening. He told him that a Millbrook police officer was on the scene and appeared to be treating the work site as a vandalism scene. He told him the permit was in the window and the officer had not looked at it. Deacon Tillman was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll be there in 15 minutes. Samuel said, "Thank you." He ended the call. He stood on the steps. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He watched a second patrol car pull up to the curb. The second officer who arrived was a woman named Reyes. She was younger than Corby, calmer in her body language. She stood with Corby near the patrol car while Corby spoke to her in a low voice. Samuel could not hear what was being said. Marcus stood next to Samuel and said nothing. He was 24, and he was frightened, though he was trying not to show it. Samuel could see it in the way Marcus held his jaw. Samuel said to him quietly, "You're fine. Everything is documented. He'll see it." Marcus said, "What if he doesn't want to see it?" Samuel didn't answer that. Reyes walked up to Samuel. She introduced herself. She asked if he could explain the work being done. Samuel explained it again. He told her the permit number. He told her the permit was in the front window. He told her the contract was in his truck. He told her the work plan drawings were in his truck. He told her that the church's board chair, Deacon Robert Tillman, was on his way and would confirm everything he had said. Reyes looked at the window. She walked up to it and read the permit. She stood there for a moment. She turned and looked at Corby. Corby was looking at his phone. Reyes came back to Samuel. She said, "I see the permit. It has your company name on it." Samuel said yes. She said, "I'm going to need us to wait here until we can verify with the property owner or the church representative." Samuel said, "He's on his way. He'll be here in a few minutes." She nodded. She went back toward Corby. Samuel watched them talk. He could not hear the words. He saw Corby's posture, slightly defensive arms crossed. He saw Reyes gesture toward the window where the permit was posted. He saw Corby look away. Samuel had been on job sites for 30 years. He had dealt with permit inspectors, building officials, historic preservation officers, structural engineers, plumbing inspectors, fire marshals. He had dealt with every variety of official who walked onto a job site. He had never been detained on one. He had never been treated as though the permit in the window was irrelevant. He stood on the steps and breathed slowly and waited. The March light was cool and angled. A car passed on Ellison Avenue. The neighborhood around the church was quiet, in the way residential neighborhoods are quiet on Sunday afternoons. Not empty, just settled. A man in a coat walked a dog past the church steps without looking up. A child on a bicycle turned at the corner and disappeared. The ordinary world was continuing around the front steps of Greater Hope Baptist Church as though nothing unusual was happening. A man in work clothes standing on church steps, 2 police cars at the curb. An ordinary afternoon if you didn't know what it meant. Samuel knew what it meant. He had known what it meant since before Corby came out of the building and called it a possible vandalism scene. He had known it from the moment Corby had looked at him and reached for his radio. He had known it the way you know something you have been prepared for your whole life, not with surprise, but with a weight that landed precisely because it was familiar. Deacon Robert Tillman's car came around the corner of Ellison Avenue 11 minutes after Samuel's call. He parked behind the second patrol car. He was a large man, heavy-set, with white hair cut close to his head. He moved with the deliberate steadiness of a man who had been in charge of things for a long time and was not going to rush. He climbed the steps. He nodded to Samuel. He looked at Marcus. He looked at the two officers. He said to Corby, "I'm Deacon Robert Tillman. I'm the chairman of the building committee of Greater Hope Baptist Church. This is my church. This man is my contractor. What is happening here?" Corby said, "We received a call about possible vandalism. We're investigating." Deacon Tillman looked at him. He said, "Vandalism?" Corby said, "Yes, sir. We were responding to a report of suspicious activity." Deacon Tillman said, "Did you see the permit in the window?" Corby said, "We're still in the process of," Deacon Tillman said. "Did you read the permit in the window?" A pause. Corby said, "We're verifying." Deacon Tillman walked to the front window of the church. He stood in front of the permit in its plastic sleeve. He turned and looked at Corby. He said, "This permit has been in this window for 3 months. Samuel Okafor's company name is on it. The work type is on it. The permit number is on it. It has been here since the day he started this job. Did you read it when you walked up to this door?" Corby said. "The investigation was," Deacon Tillman said. "Did you read it?" It was not a question the second time. Corby said nothing. Deacon Tillman looked at Reyes. He said, "Officer, I am the authorized representative of the property owner of this building. Samuel Okafor holds our signed restoration contract. A copy is in his truck. He holds a current building permit issued by the city of Millbrook posted in the front window as required by code. He has been working on this building since January. The work he was doing today was scheduled and approved. I would like to know on what basis he is being detained." Reyes said, "Deacon Tillman, we appreciate your cooperation. We were responding to a call from a neighbor regarding sounds consistent with possible," Deacon Tillman said. "Sounds consistent with a construction crew doing demolition work, which is what they are, which the permit says they are authorized to do, which I am telling you they were doing." He looked at Samuel. He said, "Are you all right?" Samuel said, "I'm fine." His voice was level. He was fine. He was standing on the steps of a church he had been restoring for 3 months, a church whose bones he knew better than almost anyone alive. He had said everything there was to say. The deacon was saying the rest of it. While Samuel stood on the steps and waited, Reyes walked back over to him. She said, "Mr. Okafor, can I ask what specifically the work involves today?" He told her again. "Zone 4, South Nave Wall. Controlled removal of failed plaster and deteriorated lath." He described what failed plaster looked like, what lath was, what the demolition process involved. He told her about the zone plan, about the sheeting used to contain the work area, about the permit conditions that required progress photos. He was not lecturing her. He was answering her question fully because his experience told him that full answers in these situations were better than abbreviated ones. She listened. She asked if the contract with the church was in writing. He said yes, it was in his truck. She asked if she could see it. He said yes. He walked her to his truck. He unlocked it. He took the contract from the folder on the passenger seat. It was the full signed contract between Greater Hope Baptist Church, represented by Deacon Robert Tillman, and Okafor Construction and Restoration, represented by Samuel Wersish Okafor. It was 22 pages with 2 exhibits, the zone plan drawings and the specification for plaster materials. He handed it to her. She looked at the signature page. She looked at the date. She looked at the contractor's information page. She handed it back. He reached into the back seat and produced the blueprint tube. He uncapped it and unrolled one of the reproduction sheets on the truck's tailgate. He pointed to the title block with Merriman's name. He pointed to the original elevation drawing of the south nave wall, the exact wall that was open inside the building. He pointed to his own signature in the lower right corner with the date beneath it. Reyes looked at the blueprint. She looked at his signature. She looked at Samuel. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I see." She went back toward Corby. The situation resolved in the way that situations resolve when documentation is complete and witnesses are credible. Reyes spoke to her supervisor by phone. Corby spoke to the same supervisor. The permit number was run against the city's permit database. The permit was confirmed active in good standing, with no violations. Samuel's contractor's license number was verified. The work described in the permit matched the work that had been underway in the building. It took 45 minutes from the moment Samuel had stepped outside until the moment Reyes told him he was free to go back inside and continue his work. 45 minutes. He had lost 45 minutes of a working Sunday afternoon. He had lost them standing on the steps of a building where his permit was in the window. His signature was on the blueprints in his truck. His name was on a contract signed before the first piece of plaster hit the floor. He had lost them because an officer had walked up to a front door, seen a black man inside with tools and debris, and called it a vandalism scene. Without looking at the yellow permit card mounted on the glass of the door, he walked through. After Reyes confirmed with her supervisor that Samuel was free to return to work, she said to him, "I apologize for the inconvenience, Mr. Okafor." Samuel looked at her. He said thank you. He meant it. She had read the permit. She had looked at the contract. She had looked at the blueprint. She had made the call she was supposed to make. He had no grievance with her. He did not say any of this. He just said thank you. Corby stood near his patrol car and said nothing. He did not look at Samuel. He was looking at his phone. Samuel thanked Deacon Tillman. Deacon Tillman gripped his shoulder once and said, "You finished this building. That's what matters." Samuel nodded. Deacon Tillman got in his car and drove back to his sister's house. Samuel and Marcus went back inside. They had about an hour and 20 minutes of daylight left. Samuel picked up his field notebook from where he had set it down. He found his place. He made the note about the floor joists. He looked at the revealed framing. He assessed it, as he had been doing when the front door opened. He reached his hand into the wall cavity and pressed his palm against the original framing. The old-growth pine had been standing in this building for 104 years. It was solid and dense and absolutely sound. He made another note. He put his hard hat on. He told Marcus to get back up on the scaffold. They worked until the light was gone. Samuel Isaiah Okafor had grown up in Millbrook. Not on the east side, but close to it, a neighborhood of small houses and community gardens, and a Catholic school he had attended until 8th grade when his family had moved. His father had been a maintenance worker at the city's largest hotel, a man who could fix anything with his hands. He had taught Samuel the names of tools before Samuel knew how to read. His mother had worked at a dry cleaner's and had been the person in the family who kept records. Insurance papers, school records, tax filings, all of it organized in a binder on the shelf in the hallway. "You keep your paperwork straight," she had told Samuel more than once. "Nobody can take away what you can prove." He had not known at 9 or 10 years old what she meant exactly. He had understood it as an instruction. He had followed it without fully understanding it until much later. The east side of Millbrook had been where his father's friends lived. His father had grown up 2 blocks from Greater Hope Baptist Church. He had taken Samuel there for a funeral when Samuel was 12. It was the funeral of a great-uncle named Ezekiel, a man Samuel had only met twice, but who had been his father, said a man of considerable dignity. Samuel remembered sitting in the pew and looking up at the walls of the church. The high plaster walls, the columns, the gallery above. He remembered thinking the building had a quality of permanence, that it was built to last a long time, that whoever had built it had meant for it to stand. He had not thought about that memory for years. When he first walked into Greater Hope as its restoration contractor, he had felt something he did not immediately identify. He stood in the nave with a clipboard and a flashlight running his beam along the upper sections of the south wall. It took him a day or two to realize what it was. He had stood in this building before. He had sat in its pews. He had looked up at these walls when he was 12 years old, and his great-uncle was in a box at the front, and the building had felt permanent and right. Now he was the one responsible for making it permanent, for keeping it right. He had not told Deacon Tillman this. It was not relevant to the contract. It was just something he knew. He had started in carpentry at 16, sweeping up at a cabinet shop owned by a man named Lorenzo Bates. Bates had seen something in the way Samuel handled wood and had put him on the bench at 17. He had framed houses at 20, learned finish carpentry at 22. He found his way into restoration work at 26, when he took a job with a preservation contractor doing work on a historic district 8 miles north of Millbrook. That work changed him. He stood in a building from 1888 and felt its age in the framing and the craftsmanship and the choices the original builders had made. He decided this was what he wanted to do. Okafor Construction and Restoration was incorporated when Samuel was 36. He had done the paperwork himself with a lawyer's help and had filed the contractor's license renewal every 2 years without fail since. He had kept records of every job permits, contracts, inspection reports, progress photos, completion certificates. He had a filing cabinet in his office at home containing the documentation for every project he had ever been the contractor of record on. 22 years of jobs, dozens of buildings, churches, civic halls, old homes, a Carnegie library, a county courthouse annex. He had never had a complaint filed against him by a building department. He had never had a permit revoked. He had never had a structural failure. He had never hurt anyone on a job site. His insurance was current. His bonds were current. His license was current. None of that had mattered to Brent Corby. Corby had walked up to a front door, not looked at the permit, and called it a vandalism scene. This was not new. The particular configuration black contractor permit in the window officer who doesn't read it was new. But the underlying experience was not new. Samuel had been a licensed contractor for 22 years in Millbrook and the surrounding counties. He had walked onto job sites where inspectors looked at him with an extra pause, a moment of recalibration. He had had customers call him after he submitted a bid and ask very politely with careful language whether he was experienced with this type of work. He had had suppliers who needed to be asked twice for orders who verified his account number more carefully than they verified the account numbers of other contractors. None of it was extraordinary. None of it was reported or filed or entered into any record. It was the low, continuous cost of being a black man in a profession where most of the faces looked different from his. He had absorbed those costs and kept working. What happened at Greater Hope Baptist Church was different in one specific way. There was a body camera. There was a camera on Corby and a camera on Reyes, and they recorded what happened from the moment each officer arrived. The footage was retrievable. The footage could be reviewed. The footage showed it without interpretation or speculation, without anyone's word against anyone else's. A yellow permit card on a window. An officer who did not look at it. A licensed contractor who told that officer it was there. That footage was the difference between this incident and every other moment Samuel had absorbed and kept working. That footage was why he filed the complaint. The formal complaint process in Millbrook moved slowly, as formal complaint processes do. Samuel filed his complaint with the Millbrook Police Department's Office of Professional Standards within a week of the incident. He described the events in detail. He listed the documentation that had been available at the scene, the posted building permit visible from the street, the signed restoration contract in his truck, the work plan drawings in his truck, including the annotated reproduction blueprints with his signature on every page, the phone number for the church board chair who arrived within 12 minutes of being called and confirmed everything Samuel had said. He described what Corby had done, walked into the building, saw a black man with tools and debris, and treated it as a crime scene. He described what Corby had not done, looked at the permit in the window he walked through. He kept his language factual. He did not characterize Corby's motives. He described actions and omissions. His mother had been right. Nobody can take away what you can prove. The complaint was logged. An internal affairs investigator was assigned. The investigator would interview Corby, would interview Reyes, would review the call log, the body camera footage from both officers, and the permit records from the city building department. Samuel knew the process could take months. He did not wait for it to resolve before continuing his work. He went back to Greater Hope Baptist Church the next day. He went back the day after that. He worked through the spring. Before he went back to the church the following Monday, Samuel sat at his desk and wrote everything down. He wrote a full account of the Sunday afternoon, the timeline, the exact words as he remembered them, the names of both officers, the permit number, the time of Deacon Tillman's arrival. He noted the time Reyes told him he was free to return to work. He wrote it in plain, factual language the same way he wrote a field report. He dated it. He printed 2 copies. He put one in the project file. He mailed the other to himself, sealed. The postmark would establish the date. His mother had not specifically told him to do this, but the principle was the same. Then he went back to work. What the body camera footage showed was this Corby walking up the front steps of Greater Hope Baptist Church, pushing open the front door, pausing in the doorway. Then stepping inside without ever turning his head to the left. The permit was mounted in the window on his left. The permit was visible in the frame. It was a large yellow card in a clear sleeve on the glass. It was 2 feet to Corby's left as he stood in the doorway. He did not look at it. The footage showed him looking at the interior. It showed him looking at Samuel. It showed him looking at Marcus. It showed him reaching for his radio. The footage showed Samuel walking toward Corby. It showed Samuel saying something. The audio was clear. It showed Samuel saying that the building permit was in the window. It showed Corby telling him to step outside without looking at the window. The footage from Reyes's camera showed her arriving speaking with Corby, then walking to the window and reading the permit. It showed her standing in front of the permit for a full 30 seconds reading it. It showed her turning and looking at Corby. The investigator's report was completed 2 months after Samuel filed his complaint. It found that Officer Corby had failed to check the posted building permit prior to detaining the individuals at the scene. This failure was contrary to department policy requiring officers to assess all available documentary evidence in non-emergency situations before taking action. It found that the failure to check the permit had no basis in any articulable suspicion or exigent circumstance. It recommended a formal reprimand and remedial training. The formal reprimand was issued. It went into Corby's personnel file. It would stay there. Deacon Tillman brought the matter before the full board of Greater Hope Baptist Church at the next monthly meeting. He described what had happened. He described Samuel standing on the front steps while a police officer treated a licensed contractor as a vandalism suspect. He described the valid city permit posted in the window 2 feet from where the officer had been standing. He described 22 years of clean documented work history and the way Corby had moved past all of it without looking. The board voted unanimously to send a letter to the city of Millbrook. The letter was addressed to the mayor, the city manager, the chief of the building department, and the chief of police. It was signed by Deacon Tillman in his capacity as board chair. It commended Samuel Isaiah Okafor by name. It described his professionalism, his meticulous work, his consistent communication with the board, and his conduct during and after the incident. It noted that he had filed a formal complaint through proper channels and had returned to work the next day without interruption to the project schedule. It asked that the record reflect the church's full confidence in their contractor. The city building department received the letter. The chief of the building department pulled Samuel's permit file and reviewed the full permit history, the inspection records, the progress photos, and the zone-by-zone completion reports Samuel had been filing since January. He noted that the file was exemplary. He sent Samuel a written notice confirming that his work record on the Greater Hope Baptist Church project was fully in compliance. The department's record reflected no violations, no complaints, and no adverse findings of any kind related to the project or the incident. Samuel kept both letters. He put them in the filing cabinet with the rest of the project documentation. The restoration of Greater Hope Baptist Church continued through the spring and into early summer. Samuel and Marcus completed Zones 5 through 8 in April and May. Each zone was the same process: assess, photograph, demo, inspect the framing, repair if needed, install new lath apply, new plaster finish. The work was slow, and it was supposed to be slow. Slow was right. Slow was respectful of what the building was. There were findings. In Zone 6, Samuel opened the wall and found that a section of original framing had been incorrectly repaired sometime in the 1940s. He could tell the approximate decade from the material and the fasteners. The repair was inadequate, and behind it the original framing member had continued to deteriorate. He called Deacon Tillman. He showed him the condition. He explained the repair required. He submitted a change order with the revised scope and cost. Deacon Tillman took it to the board. The board approved it in 2 days. The repair was made and documented. In Zone 9, Samuel found something that was not a structural problem. He photographed it carefully and noted it in his field records. It was a series of pencil marks on an original framing member near the top of the wall just below where the plaster molding met the ceiling. The marks were numbers, dimensions, written in a carpenter's hand, precise and confident. They were the original layout marks from 1919. The original builder's hand on the wood still legible after 104 years. Samuel stood on the scaffold and looked at them for a long time. He photographed them from 4 angles. He noted them in his field records with the date and the zone number. He did not cover them. He left them exposed inside the new wall cavity before he closed up the zone behind the new lath in the dark of the wall where they had been for more than a century. He thought about A.R. Merriman, the architect whose name was in the title block of the 1919 blueprint. He thought about the draftsman who had laid those lines on vellum with an ink pen. He thought about the carpenter who had made those pencil marks on that framing member. None of them were alive. The work they had done was still standing. It would stand longer now because Samuel had found the failed sections and repaired them correctly. That was what the job was. That was what the job had always been. Marcus Webb did not fully understand at 24 what Samuel was doing when he worked slowly around a section of wall and pressed his palm against it. He had asked about it once early in the 2 years he had worked for Samuel, and Samuel had tried to explain it. "You're listening," Samuel had said. "You're feeling. The wall tells you things that the surface doesn't show. A hollow sound means detachment. A soft spot means water damage behind the plaster. A flex that shouldn't be there means the framing isn't what it should be. You learn to read it." Marcus had tried it. He had put his hand against the plaster and tapped and pressed and listened. He had not heard what Samuel heard. "It takes time," Samuel had said. He had not been discouraging. He had been matter-of-fact. It takes time, and it takes repetition, and it takes caring about the answer. Most people tap a wall and just want to know if it's solid or not. You have to want to know what's behind it. Marcus had thought about that for a long time. He thought about it again on the Sunday afternoon in March when he climbed down from the scaffold and walked outside. He stood on the steps while a police officer treated Samuel as though he didn't belong in the building where he had been working for 3 months. In the building whose walls he could read with his hands. He thought about the permit in the window. He thought about how clearly it was visible from where he stood. He thought about how Corby had walked up to the door and gone inside without looking at it. He thought about what that meant not as a legal matter, not as a procedural matter, but as a human matter. What it meant about what Corby had seen when he looked at Samuel. What conclusion he had reached before he read anything, before he asked anything, before he thought about what the yellow card in the window said. Marcus did not say any of this to Samuel on the steps. He stood quietly and waited the way Samuel had taught him to wait. But he carried it. He was 24, and he was going to be a licensed contractor one day. He was going to have jobs like this one, jobs in old buildings with permits in windows and contracts in trucks. He was going to carry what he had learned on those steps alongside everything Samuel had taught him about reading walls. The blueprints stayed in the tube in Samuel's truck through the whole project. He took them out regularly at the start of each zone when he was planning the approach, and at certain moments during the work when he needed to verify something against the original intent. He would unroll a sheet on the lowered tailgate of his truck and look at it in the light and find the thing he needed. His name was in the lower right corner of every sheet. He had put it there in January before the work started. He had sat at his desk and gone through the original drawings, carefully checking every dimension. When he was satisfied that the reproductions were accurate, he had signed them. He signed them the way he signed everything, with the understanding that his name meant something, that it was a commitment, that it was a statement of having done the work of looking. His signature was on those blueprints, not because he was trying to prove anything, not in anticipation of any confrontation or dispute. He had signed them because they were his working documents, and he reviewed them and he signed his work. That was who he was. When Corby had stood in the doorway of the church and reached for his radio without looking at the permit, Samuel's signature had been in his truck on every page of those blueprints. The permit had been in the window. The contract had been in the truck. Deacon Tillman had been 3 miles away, reachable by phone. Every piece of documentation that existed. All of it was present. None of it had mattered to Corby in that first moment, because Corby had looked at Samuel and Marcus and reached a conclusion before he read anything. That was the thing that could not be fixed by a permit in a window. It could be documented. It could be reported. It could result in a formal reprimand in a personnel file. But the moment itself, the moment of being looked at and found suspect before a single word was spoken, that moment could not be unhappened. Samuel knew this. He had known it before he was 30. He had been building his documentation habits in full awareness that documentation was a response to a reality that should not require that response. His meticulous records, his permit-first practice, his habit of always having the contract and the license immediately available. He had built those habits not because he thought they would prevent every such moment. He built them because when such moments came, documentation was the only language that some people were required to accept. He had also learned that documentation alone was not enough if the person who needed to read it had already decided not to. Corby had decided in the doorway. He had looked at the interior of the church, the debris, the scaffold, the tools, the 2 black men, and made a determination. He had made it before he saw the permit. He would have continued to hold it possibly if Deacon Tillman had not arrived and stood in front of the permit in the window and asked directly twice whether Corby had read it. The deacon's presence and directness had created a circumstance in which continuing to ignore the permit required an active choice that Corby was not willing to make in front of a witness. That was what witnesses were for. That was what Deacon Tillman had understood when he drove to the church. That was what Samuel had understood when he called him. Zone 10, Zone 11, Zone 12. The restoration worked its way around the sanctuary through June and into July. Samuel completed the exterior side wall zones last, because they were the most complicated, requiring the most careful attention to where the wall met the window frames and the gallery rails. He worked slowly. He worked correctly. The plasterers Samuel worked with were led by a man named Felix Navarro, who had been doing plaster work in the area for 25 years. He had learned his trade from his father, who had learned it in Mexico. Felix was not a talkative man on job sites. He arrived, he assessed the work area, he mixed, he applied. He worked the same way Samuel worked, methodically, without narration, with a quality of attention that was total while he was doing the thing. Samuel and Felix had developed over 12 years of working together, a kind of professional shorthand that required very little speech. Samuel showed Felix the original plaster sample. Felix looked at it. He looked at the lab analysis report. He nodded. He mixed to the specification and got the texture right on the first pass of the sample panel. That was why Samuel worked with him. Felix had heard through Marcus about what had happened in March. He had not brought it up to Samuel. One afternoon, while they were finishing Zone 7, Felix said without preamble, "I heard what happened here." Samuel said yes. Felix said, "You kept working." Samuel said yes. Felix looked at the wall he was working on. He said, "That's the answer." Samuel said yes. Felix went back to applying plaster. That was the entire conversation. Neither of them needed it to be longer. The plaster crew came in on the closing work for each zone. A team of 3 plasterers that Samuel had worked with for 12 years who understood historic plaster composition and could match a 100-year-old finish texture with a fidelity that most plasterers would not attempt. They were meticulous people. They were like Samuel people who cared about what was behind the surface. The finished plaster was mixed to match the original composition. Samuel had samples taken from the original plaster and analyzed by a materials conservation lab before the first zone was closed. The lab reported the composition lime putty sand horsehair and a small proportion of gypsum added for set time. The plasterers mixed to those proportions. When the new sections dried, they were indistinguishable from the original by sight. In 50 years, they would be indistinguishable by any method. The original cornice molding, the decorative plaster frieze that ran along the top of the nave walls, was preserved in its entirety. Samuel had not touched it. He had worked up to it, around it, and below it without disturbing a single inch. He had designed the zone boundaries specifically to protect it. The frieze was original to 1919. A.R. Merriman had drawn it in the blueprint, a delicate egg and dart pattern in the original elevation drawing. It was still there. It would remain. The last zone was finished in the 3rd week of July. Samuel and Marcus spent 2 days on final cleanup. They removed the scaffold, collected the sheeting and tools, vacuumed the work areas, cleaned the pews in the affected sections. They wiped the window glass on the south side of the nave, where plaster dust had settled on the sills inside. Samuel walked the full interior with his field notebook and checked every zone, every closed section, every inch of the new plaster. He found 3 small areas in the finish coat where the texture was slightly off, not structurally significant, but not right to his eye. He called the plasterers back for a half day, and they corrected the 3 areas. He walked the interior again. It was right. He stood in the nave for a while after the second walkthrough. He was not doing anything in particular. He was just standing in the finished space looking at it. The light from the south windows moved across the new plaster the way it moved across the original plaster. There was no difference in how the light fell on the wall. That was correct. That was what it was supposed to be. You were not supposed to be able to tell where the restoration work ended and the original work began. If you could tell, the restoration was wrong. He thought about the congregation that would stand in this room. He thought about the anniversary service coming in August. He thought about how many services had been held in this room, how many funerals, how many weddings, how many Sunday mornings when this building had been full of people singing. He thought about his great-uncle Ezekiel, who had been carried out of this building in a box 46 years ago, while 12-year-old Samuel had sat in a pew and looked at these walls. He had not told anyone about that memory. Not Deacon Tillman, not Marcus, not Felix. It was not relevant to the contract or the work plan. It was relevant only to him, and only in the private way that the things that drive a person's work are relevant not as explanation or justification, but as origin. He had been looking at these walls since he was 12. He had come back to make them right. He had not told anyone about that memory. It did not need to be said. It simply was. The walls were sound. The plaster was right. The building would stand. He called Deacon Tillman. He said, "We're done. It's ready for your inspection before I do the final walkthrough with the building inspector." Deacon Tillman came the next day. He walked through the sanctuary slowly, looking at each wall section, running his hand along the new plaster. He looked up at the cornice. He looked at the columns. He stood in the middle of the nave and turned slowly, looking at the full interior. He was quiet for a long time. He said, "Samuel, this is beautiful." Samuel said, "It's what it was supposed to be. We just got it back to that." Deacon Tillman looked at him. He said, "You know what this building is to this community. You know what it meant to do this right." Samuel said, "Yes, I do." They stood together in the nave of the church for a moment. The afternoon light came through the south windows and fell on the plaster that was new but was not different. It was the same building it had been in 1919, made whole again. The final inspection was conducted by a city building inspector named Hartman, who had been doing inspections in Millbrook for 21 years. He walked through the building with Samuel and his punch list. He examined the new plaster and checked the permit conditions against the work completed. He reviewed the progress photo documentation and tested the structural integrity of the closed zones by tapping the plaster with his inspection tool and listening. He nodded at several points. He said, "Good work." He said it the way inspectors say it when they mean it briefly without elaboration, because an inspector who finds good work does not need to spend a long time talking about it. He signed the final inspection card. The permit was closed out. The project was complete. Samuel took a photograph of the closed permit card with his phone. He sent it to Deacon Tillman. He took the original permit card out of the window, the yellow card that had been there since January, the card that had been there when Corby walked through the door, the card that had been there for 3 months before that Sunday afternoon in March. He rolled it carefully and put it in a cardboard tube. He put the tube with the blueprint reproductions. He drove home. He put the project file in his filing cabinet. He made himself a cup of coffee. He sat at his desk and looked at the framed copy of his contractor's license on the wall and did not think about any of it in particular. He just sat for a while. It had been a good job. It had been the kind of job he had spent his whole working life building toward. A historic building 104 years old with original documentation and original materials, and a community that cared about it. A board chair who understood what the work was for. In purely professional terms, it was one of the finest jobs he had ever done. The Carnegie Library job 10 years earlier had been the previous high watermark. That had been a full exterior restoration, masonry, repointing, window restoration, the repair of the original ornamental stonework at the entrance. That job had brought him a letter from the State Historic Preservation Office commending the quality of the work. He had that letter in the filing cabinet, too. This job was different. The Carnegie Library had been public, civic, institutional, important in its own way, but not bound up with a community in the way a church was bound up with one. The people who came to Greater Hope Baptist Church came every Sunday. They had been married in that building and had buried their parents in its ceremonies and had sat in its pews through every season of their lives. The building was not a public amenity to them. It was the physical form of something they had built and maintained and held together across a century. Doing the restoration work correctly was not a matter of professional pride alone. It was a matter of being worthy of the trust the commission represented. It had also been a job where he had been detained on the front steps as a vandalism suspect, with the permit in the window, with his name on the blueprints in his truck. Both of those things were true. Both of them would stay true. He finished his coffee. He went to bed. There is a thing that happens at the close of a long project that Samuel had never found the right words for. It was not relief, exactly. It was not satisfaction, though satisfaction was part of it. It was more like the feeling of a held breath finally let go. He had been carrying the building in his attention for 7 months in the planning phase before January through the whole spring and summer of the work. The building had been present in his thinking every day. Now it was done. He had set it down. He could feel the absence of the weight. He thought about this later, sitting at his desk in the quiet of his house. He thought about how the weight of a project was different from the weight of a worry, A project wait was productive. It was the pressure of ongoing responsibility of something incomplete that required your attention to be completed. It was not anxious wait. He had never felt anxious about the Greater Hope restoration. He had felt responsible for it. That was different. The March incident had added another weight on top of the project weight. Not the weight of anxiety, exactly. More like the weight of having to carry something in the part of yourself that should have been free to focus only on the work. He had carried both. He had kept them separate. The work was the work, the incident was the incident, and he had not let the incident contaminate the work. But they had both been there. The fact that both were now complete and resolved both in the record and finished left him with a stillness that was unusual. He recognized it as rare. The 105th anniversary service of Greater Hope Baptist Church was held on the 4th Sunday of August. The sanctuary had been cleaned and arranged 2 days before by the congregation's usher board. The new plaster was still pristine, the same soft off-white as the original plaster in the sections that had not been touched. The cornice ran along the full length of both nave walls, unbroken original. Deacon Tillman had arranged for Samuel and Marcus to be present at the anniversary service. Samuel had worn a good shirt and a tie. He was not a man who wore ties often, but this seemed like a day for one. He and Marcus sat in the third pew from the back on the south side. The pastor opened the service by acknowledging the completed restoration. He said the building had stood for 105 years because of the care of the people who built it, and because of the people who maintained it and the people who chose to restore it rather than replace it. He said the original builders had built with skill and with intention, and that the restoration had honored that. He thanked Samuel Okafor and Okafor Construction and Restoration by name. The congregation applauded. Samuel sat in the pew and looked at the wall in front of him. He looked at the plaster his team had installed. He knew exactly where the zone boundaries were, where the new plaster met the original, though you could not see the seams. He knew that behind the new plaster the framing was sound, and the lath was correct, and the materials were matched to the original. He knew that in Zone 9, behind the new lath, the original framing member still bore the pencil marks of the 1919 Carpenter. He knew that A.R. Merriman's blueprint in Samuel's reproduction with Samuel's signature in the lower right corner was in a tube in his home office. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the gallery. He looked at the columns. He sat quietly and listened to the service. Marcus leaned over and said softly, "It looks good." Samuel said, "It always looked good. We just fixed the parts that were failing." Marcus thought about that. A formal reprimand in a police officer's personnel file is a document. It is a record. It states in official language that something did not happen as it should have happened. It does not undo the thing that happened. It does not give back the 45 minutes that Samuel stood on the steps. It does not address what Corby saw when he looked through the doorway and reached for his radio. It is a document, and documents are limited. But Samuel believed in documents. He had always believed in them. He had built his professional life on the principle that documentation was the foundation of credibility. The record mattered. Keeping the record clean and complete and accurate was both a professional obligation and a form of self-protection. He had believed this because his mother had told him to keep his paperwork straight, and because he had spent 22 years in a profession where things could go wrong. The record was how you proved what had happened. The complaint he filed created a record. It created an investigation. It produced a finding. The finding produced a reprimand. The reprimand was in Corby's file. If Corby did this again, that reprimand would be there. If he walked up to a building, saw a black man with tools, and called it a vandalism scene without reading the permit, the prior record would be waiting. It would be in his file when the next complaint was reviewed. That was what the process was for. He had spoken once briefly with Reyes after the investigation concluded. He had run into her in the parking lot of the hardware store on Central Avenue 3 months after the incident. She had recognized him. He had recognized her. They had nodded. She had hesitated, then said, "I'm glad it worked out correctly." He had said thank you for reading the permit. She had looked away briefly. She had said I should have said something to him at the scene. He said, you said the important thing. You confirmed the permit. She had nodded. She had left. That was all. He bore her no ill will. She had done her job, including the part where she recognized what the permit said and confirmed it. What she had not done was what she herself knew she had not done, say clearly at the scene that the situation was resolved. She had needed the supervisor's call to do that when she could have done it herself. He understood why. Working with a partner who outranked you in seniority on a call you had been brought in on after the initial assessment was already made was not a simple situation. She had found her way to the right conclusion. It had taken longer than it should have. Samuel did not tell himself that the process was adequate. He did not tell himself that the reprimand made it right. He told himself that the process was what existed, and that using it correctly was the right thing to do, and that he had done it. He had documented the incident completely. He had filed the complaint with specificity and factual precision. He had let the process run. The process had produced a finding. He had kept his record clean. The church board's letter to the city commending his work had been entered into the public record. The city building department's written clearance of his work record was in his file. Those documents existed. Anyone who wanted to know what had happened on that Sunday afternoon in March and what the record showed about Samuel Isaiah Okafor could read them. There was something else that Samuel thought about in the weeks after the project closed. He thought about the 1919 blueprint. He thought about A.R. Merriman, whose name was in the title block. He had tried to find out who Merriman was. He had done a brief search in the County Historical Society's architecture records in the city directories from the period in the building permit records for the church from 1919. He had found a permit which listed the architect as A.R. Merriman of Millbrook. He had found no other record, no other buildings credited to Merriman in the city records Samuel had access to. One building, Greater Hope Baptist Church. He did not know if Merriman had been a black architect. The neighborhood the church was built in was black, and the congregation was black, and in 1919 a black congregation building a church in a black neighborhood might well have chosen a black architect. Or might not have. He did not know. He knew only that someone named A.R. Merriman had drafted those drawings with care and precision, had designed a building that was still standing 104 years later, and had put their name in the title block. Samuel had put his name in the lower right corner of every reproduction sheet. Not in the title block, not in the space where the original designer's name was, in the contractor notation space. The space where you put your name when you were the person responsible for the building as it stood now accountable for the work you were doing on it. The church's archival files were modest but well kept. A tin box of original documents that included the 1919 permit, the cornerstone certificate, a photograph of the building under construction, and a typed membership list from 1920. The photograph was remarkable. It showed the exterior of the building mid-construction, the walls up, but the roof not yet complete. In the foreground, a group of men stood in their working clothes, not posing exactly, just paused, caught by the camera while the work was momentarily still. Samuel had studied that photograph. He could see the original brick coursing the window openings waiting for their frames. He could see the scaffold the workers had used different from his simpler, heavier, but the same basic idea. Men at height working on a wall. He had left the photograph in the archival box and kept the box as he found it in the church office where it belonged. He had photographed the photograph with his phone. That image was in his project files. He wanted to have it. He thought about that sometimes. The line of custody from Merriman to whoever had done the 1930s edition to whoever had repaired the fire damage in 1967, to the people who had done various smaller jobs over the decades, to Samuel Isaiah Okafor in the present. Each person who had put their hands on this building, who had cared about it enough to do it correctly, whose work was either still standing or had been superseded by better work. Samuel was somewhere in that line. The work he had done would stand. That was what the blueprints were for. That was what the signature was for. It was a statement that he had been here, that he had been the contractor of record, that the work reflected his judgment and his standard and his name. It was also, as it happened, exactly the kind of documentation that made it impossible to pretend that the man standing in the building with the tools didn't belong there. He had not signed those blueprints in anticipation of Brent Corby. He had signed them because that was how he worked. But they had been there in the tube in the truck available if anyone had needed to look at them, along with the contract, along with the permit in the window, along with Deacon Tillman's phone number and the contacts on his phone. Everything was there. It had always been there. The formal reprimand was the end of the official record on that day in March. But the unofficial record continued in different ways. Samuel told the story not often, not with anger, but when it was relevant. He told it to a young contractor he was mentoring, a woman named Denise Achebe, who was 2 years into running her own small framing operation. He told her because she had asked him about documentation habits, about his permit-first practice, about why he always had the contract in the truck. He explained it to her in full. She had listened carefully. She had asked about the permit in the window. She had asked whether he thought the permit would have made a difference if Corby had been more determined. Samuel had thought about that. He had said, maybe not. Maybe nothing makes a difference with someone who has decided before they look. But the documentation makes a record, and records outlast the moment. Corby's decision is in his personnel file now. My work is in the building department's archive. The church board's letter is in the public record. The moment is over. The records remain. Denise had nodded slowly. She said, "That's a long way to think about it." Samuel had said, "You have to think about it that way. The other way, waiting for the moment not to happen, that's not a strategy you can build on." Denise had said, "Does it ever stop?" The need to have everything documented, to always be ready to prove it. Samuel had been quiet for a moment. He had thought about whether the honest answer was discouraging. He had decided the honest answer was more useful than a comfortable one. He had said, "I don't know anyone it stopped for. I know people who stopped needing it as often." You build reputation. You build relationships. You build a record long enough that it speaks for itself. There are jobs now I can bid on and get because the people in the room already know my work. There are calls I get that start with, "We heard about what you did on the Riverside Church," and the conversation is different. But I still carry the license. I still have the contract in the truck. I still post the permit first. Denise said, "What if you'd been someone who didn't have all that ready?" Samuel said, "That's a different story. That's the story of someone who didn't get to prove it because they didn't have it ready. I have it ready because my mother told me to keep my paperwork straight when I was 9 years old, and I listened to her and never stopped. Not everyone gets that instruction. Not everyone gets 22 years to build the record. The documentation exists because I had the time and resources to create it." A younger contractor, a newer contractor, someone who started the job 3 weeks ago instead of 3 months ago, they would have had a harder time. The principle is the same. The position is not. He had thought about his mother. He had thought about the binder on the shelf in the hallway. Nobody can take away what you can prove. He had been almost 60 years learning what she meant. Denise Achebe got a job the following autumn doing the framing on a small addition to a 1920s house in a historic district. It was her first permitted job in a historic district. She called Samuel when she got the contract. He told her, "Pull the original drawings if any exist. Post the permit first thing. Keep a copy of the contract in the truck. Call me if anything comes up." She called him twice during the job. Once about a structural question involving a notched floor joist she had found. Once about an inspector who was being difficult about the header specification. Both times, Samuel talked her through it. Both times, she resolved it. Both times, the resolution was in the documentation, the plan the engineer had stamped the permit conditions that specified the allowable modifications. It was in the record. He just helped her find it. When the job was done, she called him and said, "You were right. It's all in the record." He said, "It's always in the record if you put it there." She said, "Thank you." He said, "Keep going." Marcus Webb got his own contractor's license the following spring. Samuel wrote the character reference for his license application. He described Marcus's technical work honestly and in detail, his development as a carpenter, his ability to learn from observation, his attention to the principles of historic restoration. He did not mention the Sunday afternoon in March. He did not need to. It was part of Marcus's formation as a tradesman, part of what he had learned, but it was not a qualification that belonged on a license application. The license application was about the work. The work was what Marcus had earned. On the day Marcus got his license number, he called Samuel and told him. Samuel said, "Good. Now keep it clean. Never let it lapse. Keep your permits current. Keep your paperwork straight." Marcus said, "I know." Samuel said, "I know you know. I'm saying it anyway." He said it the way his mother had said certain things to him, not because they weren't already known, but because some things needed to be said aloud, between a person who had learned them the hard way and a person who was going to learn them too. Greater Hope Baptist Church stood on the corner of Ellison Avenue and 14th Street on the east side of Millbrook. Its interior walls were sound. The plaster was matched to the original in composition and surface. The frieze ran unbroken along both nave walls, original to 1919. Behind the new plaster in Zone 9, a carpenter's pencil marks from 1919 still read the dimensions of a wall section. It had been standing for more than a century. It would stand for more centuries yet. The building permit for the restoration project was closed and the city's records completed without violations, with a full progress photo archive and inspection documentation. Samuel's contractor's license was current. Okafor Construction and Restoration was in its 23rd year. The 105th anniversary service had been attended by 340 people. The restored sanctuary had held them as it had been holding congregations for 105 years. The walls whole, the ceiling sound, the light coming through the south windows in the long late summer afternoon and falling across the pews in columns that moved slowly as the earth turned. On the last Sunday of that August after the service, Deacon Tillman found Samuel in the vestibule as the congregation was filing out. He shook his hand. He held it for a moment. He said, "I want you to know. When I came that day and I pointed to the permit and asked him if he had read it, I wasn't doing that for him. I was doing it for the record." Samuel looked at him. He said, "I know." Deacon Tillman said, "The permit had been in that window since January, 3 months. He walked through that door, and he looked at you, and he didn't need to read it because he had already made up his mind. I wanted that on record. I wanted someone to have to answer the question out loud." Samuel said he didn't answer it. Deacon Tillman said no, but the footage showed him not answering it. "That's the record." Samuel nodded. Deacon Tillman let go of his hand. He said, "You finished the work. That's always been the answer. You keep doing the work and you keep the record straight and the work speaks." Samuel said, "Yes, sir." He walked out of the church. He stood on the steps, the same steps where he had stood in March in the wrong light of that afternoon, waiting for a process to complete that should never have started. He stood on them now in the good light of late August, with the congregation moving past him on the sidewalk below. People he knew by name after 3 months on their building. People who nodded to him and said good afternoon as they walked to their cars. The building was behind him. He could feel it, the way he could feel any building. He had worked on a kind of awareness of the structure, the knowledge of where things were and what state they were in. The walls were sound. The plaster was right. The building would stand. He walked down the steps. He got in his truck. He drove home. Samuel Isaiah Okafor was 58 years old and had been restoring old buildings for more than 30 years. He had learned every skill he possessed through work observation and a commitment to doing the thing correctly. He had learned that documentation was not bureaucracy. It was self-possession. It was accountability. It was the habit of a person who understood that their name meant something and was prepared to prove it. He had also learned, not through choice but through experience, that documentation could not change what a person saw when they looked at him. It could not repair the moment of being looked at as a suspect in the building where you were the licensed contractor. It could not give back the 45 minutes on the steps. It could not address the thing that had no name in the permit system or the personnel file. The act of looking at a black man with tools in a building and reaching for a radio before reading the permit posted in the window 2 feet away. What documentation could do was create a record that outlasted the moment. That was what it did. The record existed. The reprimand was in the file. The church board's letter was in the public record. The building inspector's clearance was in the permit archive. Samuel's work history, clean and complete across 22 years, was in the records of the Millbrook Building Department. And in the restored interior of Greater Hope Baptist Church, the work itself stood, the plaster matched the framing sound, the cornice intact, the building whole. The work itself stood. It would stand after Samuel. It would stand after the people who saw it. It would stand long after that Sunday in March had receded from every memory involved. The building would be there on the corner of Ellison Avenue and 14th Street for the next congregation, and the congregation after that, 100 years from now, 150. And Samuel had put his hands on it. His name was on the blueprints. That was the record. That was the answer. Subscribe our channel if these are the stories you come here to find. We will keep telling them. Some buildings are built once and then kept generation by people who understood that the work of care is also the work of witness.